The sea at night has its own silence. Not the silence of an empty room, not the silence of sleep. Something older, something that breathes. On the deck of a turtle ship in the year of the dragon, there was a lantern. A single lantern, burning low. And beside it, a man who had not slept in 3 days, bent over a table no wider than a door, writing in a journal by the light of that flame. He was not writing orders. He was not writing strategy. He was writing grief. And just inside the hatch, in the dark where the ladder met the lower deck, there was another man, younger, quieter, holding a bowl of cold millet he knew would not be eaten. He had been standing there for an hour. He would stand there another.
If you are new here, welcome. Edmund recalls these things, so they are not lost. The great men fill the histories. The quiet ones fill the spaces between. If you wish to stay, press the small bell below. It means the next memory finds its way to you in its own time, like a ship finding harbor in the dark. My name was Dohyun. I was 19 years old when I was assigned to serve the ship's chaplain aboard the geomungo, the turtle ship, in the first year of the Japanese invasions. The chaplain was a gentleman, old and slow and prone to seasickness, and my duties were modest. Prepare the morning incense, copy the prayers into the ship's record, bring food to those who could not leave their stations.
But the chaplain was often ill, and so, in the way that modest duties grow into something larger when no one else is watching, I began to serve the Admiral instead. Not as an aide, not as a soldier. I had no rank for that, simply as the one who was there. Yeosu was 47 years old. He had fought before. He would fight again. He carried in his body 3 decades of war, real and remembered and anticipated. And he carried it the way a ship carries its ballast, invisibly, below the waterline, essential to the balance of the whole. I brought him his meals. I left them outside his door. Most mornings, they were still there when I returned.
The Admiral woke before anyone. This was not a rumor or a legend. I know it because I, too, woke before anyone, out of duty. And he was always already awake. He rose at what the sailors called the third watch, the deep hour before the false dawn, when the sea is at its most absolute. No stars some nights, no horizon, just the sound of the hull and the water, and the distant breathing of 300 sleeping men. He washed his face with cold water from a wooden basin. Always cold. He believed, I think, that warmth was a kind of indulgence he had not yet earned. Then he wrote. He kept a journal, you may have heard of it, called the Nanjung Ilgi, the War Diary. Every morning, without exception, he recorded the weather, the movements of his fleet, the news from scouts, but also the names of men who had died, the names of men who were sick, smaller things, the direction of the wind, the color of the sky. He wrote the way a man prays, methodically, quietly, as if the act of writing were itself a form of asking. I read once an entry he had written after a great victory. It said, "The enemy retreated.
I do not know how many died. The sea was red for a time. That was all.
No triumph, no pride, just the sea and the color of it. I brought him tea at sunrise. He drank it standing, looking out at the water. I never spoke during this time. I had learned, quickly, that silence offered freely is different from silence that comes from having nothing to say. He knew the difference too. We stood that way for years. The Admiral played the geomungo. I do not know who taught him. I do not know when he learned. I only know that tucked behind the maps, beside the ink blocks and the rolled battle charts, there was a 6-stringed instrument he had carried with him since before I knew him. He played badly. I say this with great respect. He played the way a man prays, in a language he only half remembers, reaching for something, finding pieces of it, losing the rest. The same passage, repeated, stopped, begun again. He played at night, when the fleet was anchored and the men were quiet. He did not play for anyone. He played facing the stern, toward the open sea, as though he were performing for the water itself. Once, one of the younger officers said, behind his hand but not quietly enough, that the Admiral's playing was the only thing the Japanese could hear that might frighten them away. The men laughed.
The Admiral, who had heard this perfectly, said nothing. That evening, he played for longer than usual. I sat on the lower deck and listened through the boards. It was not beautiful, but it was honest. And honesty, I have come to believe, is its own kind of beauty. Slower to arrive, harder to name, but unmistakable when you find it. He had a brush he used for everything. Not a fine brush, not the kind the court scholars used, with their lacquered handles and their carefully sorted bristles. This was a working brush, its handle worn smooth from years of holding, its tip splayed slightly at one side from some pressure he applied without thinking.
He used it for his journal. He used it to draft letters to the king, letters that were often ignored, sometimes misread, occasionally used against him. He used it to draw quick maps of harbors and coastal inlets, maps that existed nowhere else because he made them himself, from memory, from observation, from standing on the deck and simply looking at the shore. He replaced the bristles twice, that I knew of. Both times, he kept the old ones in a small cloth pouch. I asked him once, it was the boldest thing I ever said to him, what he kept them for. He looked at the pouch for a moment. "I am not certain," he said.
And then he tucked it back into his jacket. I think about that pouch sometimes, the worn-out bristles of a brush that had written so many names of the dead, kept not from sentimentality, kept because he was not yet certain what to do with the weight of things. Some men build monuments. Some men write histories. He kept a cloth pouch. After the Battle of Hansan Island, the greatest victory, the one the histories remember most, the Admiral did not celebrate. The fleet had destroyed 60 Japanese warships. The sea around Gyeoje Island was still thick with debris, with smoke, with the distant sounds of things settling into water. The men were exhausted and exhilarated, the way men are after they have done something they did not know they could do. The Admiral dismissed the officers. He dismissed his aides.
He sat alone on the rear deck as the sun went down. I was there because no one had told me to leave, and also because in 3 years of quiet service, I had learned that being overlooked is not the same as being unwanted. He sat for a very long time. At some point, without turning, he said, "Do you pray, Dohyun?" I said yes. For what? I thought about it honestly. For the men, I said. For the ones we've lost. For the ones who are frightened. He was quiet. "I cannot pray," he said eventually. "I have tried." The words come out as orders. He almost smiled when he said this. Not quite. "Then I will pray for you," I said. He nodded once. A small nod, the kind that means more than a bow. The sun went down. The sea went dark. I prayed for him, quietly, the way the chaplain had taught me, not asking for victory, not asking for safety, just asking that the weight he carried might, for one night, be a little less. I do not know if it helped, but I offered it, and he let me. Yi Sun Sin is remembered. The histories know his name. The statues stand in Seoul. The turtle ships are replicated in museums, their iron flanks repainted, their cannons silent. But history is a great hall with very few chairs. Most of the people who lived inside the story never made it through the door. Edmund wonders about the others, the ones beside the famous men and women, the ones who prayed, who carried bowls of cold millet, who stood in doorways and held their silence like a lantern. Who do you think of? From history, from your own family, from any story you know, whose quiet life deserves to be recalled? Leave a name in the comments. Edmund will remember it. The chaplain recovered eventually. I returned to my modest duties, the incense, the prayers, the copying. The Admiral died 3 years later at the final battle of the war. He was struck by a musket ball. His last words, according to those beside him, were, "Do not let them know I am dead. Keep beating the drum." I was not there. I should tell you how it began. Not the war. The war began the way all wars begin. Suddenly, and then all at once, and then so completely that you could not remember what quiet had felt like, or where you had last put it down. I mean, how I came to be on the ship. I was born in Yeosu, a harbor town, a town that smelled of salt and gutted fish and the particular low-tide smell that has no name but every coastal child knows. My father was a net maker, my grandfather before him. There was a kind of destiny in this, the making of nets, the patient knotting of things together so that what you are trying to hold does not slip through. I learned to read from the village chaplain, who was a slow man and a kind one, and who believed that literacy was a form of devotion, that to read the sutras properly, you needed first to understand the shape of language. He taught me the characters, one at a time. I was not especially gifted, but I was patient. And patience, I have found, is more useful than talent over the long distances. I was 17 when the Japanese ships appeared on the horizon. I remember the exact moment. I was carrying a basket of mending up from the lower village. The light was afternoon light, that particular late spring light that turns the sea the color of hammered bronze. And I looked up because there was a sound. Not a loud sound, a low one, the kind that travels through the water and up through the soles of your feet before it reaches your ears. The ships came over the horizon like a rumor that turns out to be true. Within 3 days, I had been assigned to the fleet. Within a week, I had learned that the shape of bravery is mostly the shape of not running when everything in your body is asking you to. The turtle ship is not a comfortable vessel. History has made it legendary, and rightly so. But inside the legend is a smell of wet rope and lamp oil and unwashed men pressed into a space barely large enough to swing a sword. The iron plating on the roof was to prevent Japanese soldiers from boarding. It was also, in summer, an excellent way to cook everyone inside.
The Admiral had designed improvements to the ship himself. Or rather, he had stood on the deck of an older design and told people what was wrong with it, which amounts to the same thing. He had strong opinions about where the cannon ports should sit, about the angle of the dragon's mouth at the prow, from which, in battle, we expelled a thick yellow smoke of sulfur and burning straw to blind and confuse the enemy, about the placement of the oars, the slope of the hull, the precise distribution of weight that kept the ship riding low and fast. He had these opinions the way some men have religion, completely, quietly, and without any particular need to convince others of their correctness. He was often right. I watched him, once, correct a master shipwright mid-sentence. The shipwright was a man 30 years his senior, who had built more vessels than he could count, and the Admiral interrupted him, gently but absolutely, and drew a small diagram on a piece of wood with a charcoal stick, and said, "If the port sits here, the recoil will transfer to this beam. Move it forward by the width of a hand." The shipwright looked at the diagram. He moved the port. The Admiral never mentioned it again. This was his way. He did not need credit for being right. He only needed the thing to be right. I have met very few people in my life for whom this was genuinely true, who cared more about the outcome than about being seen to care, and each one of them had a particular quality of stillness, as though they had simply set down the weight that most people carry and found they could move more freely without it. The turtle ship moved fast on the water. It was not beautiful. It was functional in the way that a good tool is functional. Nothing wasted, everything purposeful. Its design so complete that there was nothing to admire because there was nothing extraneous to separate from necessity. I cleaned the cannon ports 3 times a week. I swept the lower deck. I carried messages between the Admiral and his officers when the signal flags were obscured by smoke or weather. In this way, I learned things. Not strategy, I had no training for that, but texture. The texture of how decisions were made, and by whom, and at what cost. There were men around the Admiral who loved him, and men who feared him, and men who did both at once, which is the most common relationship between soldiers and the commanders they respect. His second-in-command was a man named Won-gyun. I will speak of him carefully, because Edmund does not judge, but Won-gyun was the kind of man who understood his own abilities more generously than others did. He was brave, I will give him that. In battle, he did not flinch, but he was also vain and jealous, and possessed of the particular quality that makes a man dangerous in positions of power. He could not distinguish between disagreement and disrespect.
Yi Sun-sin disagreed with him often. The Admiral disagreed with everyone who was wrong, regardless of rank or feeling. Won-gyun took this personally. The other officers I remember more warmly. There was a man, I will call him simply the Navigator, because I have lost his full name to time, who had the quality of knowing exactly where he was in the world at any given moment, not just on the water, in rooms, in conversations. He always seemed to understand what was happening 2 steps before anyone else, not from cunning, but from simple attention. I admired the Navigator. He died at Chilchonryang. But that is later. I am getting ahead of myself. Edmund is patient. The story has the shape it has, and it does not become a different shape by telling it faster. In my first battle, I was sick. Not from the motion of the sea. I had grown up on the harbor, and my stomach was accustomed to the water's rhythms. I was sick from the sound. Cannon fire at close range is not loud the way a voice is loud. It is physical. It travels through wood and water and bone. It sits in your chest like a second heartbeat, except it arrives irregularly, and sometimes does not come at all for a moment. And in that silence, your body anticipates the next one so completely that the anticipation is its own kind of suffering. I was assigned to the lower deck during battle. My job was to keep the powder barrels away from the torchmen, and to carry messages if the voice drums were not heard. And this was my primary purpose, the one the chaplain had assigned before he took ill, to pray. I prayed a great deal that first day. I do not know how much of it reached anywhere. The battle was over quickly, as early victories often are. The Japanese fleet had not expected us. They had not expected the turtle ships, which looked from a distance like nothing they had seen, low and dark and smoking, and apparently indifferent to the arrows and firebolts that scattered off the iron roof. Afterward, on the deck, a sailor showed me a split in the railing where a Japanese sword had caught the wood. The split was clean and deep. He told me it had been made by a man who had almost made it over the side before he was stopped. Almost. I looked at the word almost for a long time that day. Most of life, I came to understand, is made of almosts. I was not supposed to read the Admiral's journal. I want to be honest about this. I did not steal it. I did not pry. But there was an evening when the Admiral was called suddenly to the upper deck. Some signal from the watch, some distant ship sighted, and he left the journal open on his table. And I was in the room to collect the tea things, and I looked. One entry. It said, "My mother sent rice cakes with the last supply boat. I could not eat them. I did not tell her this. The crew ate them. I watched from the upper deck. Some of the younger men had not had rice cakes since they left home. I am glad they had them. Tomorrow we move south." That was the whole entry. I stood there for a long time with the tea bowl in my hands. Here was the thing about Yi Sun-sin that the histories sometimes lose in their effort to make him bronze and permanent. He felt everything. He felt it as completely as any of us, perhaps more so, because he felt it in the context of what it would cost him to let it show. He had left home a son. He was at sea, a commander. These two things sat inside the same body and did not reconcile easily. His mother was in her 80s. She lived in the coastal village of Asan. She sent rice cakes when she could. He watched younger men eat them from the upper deck, alone, and wrote it down. and moved south. I have thought about that image for 60 years. The court in Myeongnyang heard about the victories. They heard about Okpo, about Sachon, about Hansando, where 60 Japanese ships burned in water that was red for 2 days.
Dispatches arrived from the south and were read aloud in the halls of the palace, and the men in those halls nodded and praised the Admiral's name and asked when he would send the head of the Japanese commander so that it could be displayed at the gate. He did not send the head. He sent supply requests. He sent reports on the state of his ships and the health of his men, and the location of Japanese coastal fortifications that no one in Hanyang had mapped correctly, and that he had mapped himself by sailing close to them in the dark with a small paper balanced on his knee. The court was annoyed by the supply requests. The court wanted the head. I know this because I copied his dispatches. This was another of my quiet duties. The chaplain, in better days, had served as a kind of secondary scribe, and when the main scribes were occupied with tactical documents, I was assigned the correspondence. I copied each letter in a clean hand and pressed the Admiral's seal into the wax and watched the messenger take them north toward the capital. I never knew which ones arrived. Some did not. The roads were dangerous. Messengers were sometimes killed or turned back or bribed by factions I did not fully understand. The Admiral knew this. He wrote everything twice. 2 copies, 2 messengers, 2 routes when possible. He wrote as though he expected to be misunderstood and took what precautions he could against it. This, too, was a kind of wisdom I did not fully recognize until much later. The second winter of the war was the hardest. The Japanese had taken the land. They held the roads, the northern passes, much of the peninsula above the Han River. The king had fled to the Chinese border. The court was scattered. There were rumors of collaboration and treachery, and men who had decided that survival was its own form of loyalty to something, though they were not always certain what. At sea, we held. The fleet was intact. The Admiral had not lost a ship in battle, not one, and this was either a miracle or a function of extraordinarily careful planning, depending on whether you believe those two things are different. We spent that winter in a fortified harbor on the southern coast. The ships were in repair. The men were cold and sick and homesick, and some of them died of illness who had survived the fighting, which is always the way. The body lets down its guard when the immediate danger passes. The Admiral played the geomungo more that winter. I do not know if he was worse at it than before, or if the cold simply made it sound different. But there were nights when the instrument's low drone came up through the boards of the lower deck, slow and unresolved, searching for something it did not quite find. I asked him once, it was during this winter, one of the few conversations we had that was longer than a sentence, whether the music meant something to him. He considered this seriously. "My wife plays," he said. "She plays well. When I was a young officer, before everything, she would play in the evening, and I would sit in the garden and listen through the paper screen. You could not see her, only the music coming through." He looked at the geomungo. "When I play it badly," he said, "I can hear what it should sound like. In my memory, I can hear how she would have played this." He said nothing more. Outside, the winter sea was the color of slate. I left him with it. He wrote to his son. He had 3 sons. The eldest had come briefly to serve beside him.
The second was managing the family land in his absence. The youngest was still a child. He wrote to all of them. Long letters, careful letters, letters that contained practical advice, and also, tucked between the practical advice like a pressed flower between the pages of a ledger, something that was almost tenderness. He wrote, "The sea here is very wide, and I am not yet accustomed to the width of it after all this time." He wrote, "Study your characters, not because you will need them for examinations, but because a man who cannot read his own country's words is a stranger in his own house." He wrote, "I dream sometimes that I am walking in the yard at home, and I can hear your mother working inside, and everything is completely ordinary, and I am so happy to hear that sound that I am afraid to go inside in case it ends." He wrote these things. I copied them. I do not know how many arrived. The road from the coast to Asan was dangerous all through those years. The Japanese patrols, the bandits who had decided that chaos was an opportunity, the ordinary difficulty of distance in a country at war. He kept writing. Every week, when the dispatch boat came, there was a bundle of letters in his handwriting, sealed and addressed, waiting in the same place on the table. He never mentioned them to me. But I noticed, the mornings after the dispatch boat left, that he stood a little longer at the railing, looking north, toward the land, not the sea. I have told you I would speak carefully about Wongyum. Here is what I can say without judgment. Wongyun was given command of the Right Naval Division. This was a position of significant responsibility, and he held it with competence, which I do not wish to diminish. He fought. He was not a coward. But he was a man who measured his own importance by how closely it approached the importance of those above him. And Yi Sun-sin was so far above him, in skill, in reputation, in the quiet respect of every sailor in the fleet, that the gap must have been very painful to live beside. He began to write letters to the capital. Not about the war, about Yi Sun-sin. I did not read these letters. I only know of their existence because the Admiral did not tell me. He never told me anything directly. But because of the change in his manner after each dispatch boat from the north, there was a particular stillness that came over him, a different kind of stillness from the meditative one I had come to recognize. This stillness had an edge, a controlled quality, as though he were holding something at a distance with both hands. In the year of our greatest danger on the sea, when the Japanese changed tactics, when they stopped fighting us and began to avoid us, to slip past the fleet and land on beaches we could not cover, to burn the coastal villages we were trying to protect, it was not the Japanese who concerned me most. It was the letters going north. In the second year after Hansando, a message came from Asan. I was not in the room when he read it. I do not know the exact moment of reading, the exact shape of his face in that moment. I was on the lower deck, mending a signal flag, when the officer I called the navigator came down and said, quietly, that the Admiral's mother had died. He said it with the particular gentleness that men who are accustomed to casualty develop for the deaths that are not casualties, the ones that arrive from the ordinary direction, from age and body, and the simple ending of a long life, rather than from iron and fire. I went to the door of the Admiral's cabin. I stood there for a long time. I did not knock. Inside, there was silence. Not the working silence, the journal and brush silence I knew well. Something else. Something with a different weight. In the Korean custom, a son who loses his mother is in mourning. He should not fight. He should withdraw from service, tend to the rites, sit with the grief in the proper way.
The Admiral could not withdraw. The war did not give permission. He emerged from his cabin 2 hours after receiving the news. He was in full uniform. He had shaved. His journal was under his arm. He walked to the upper deck and looked at the fleet, the ships riding at anchor in the harbor, the gray winter water, the coastline he was holding against the relentless, grinding patience of an enemy that had not given up. He stood there for a very long time. I brought him tea. He held it without drinking it. She made the rice cakes herself, he said, to no one in particular. Even at the end. Her hands were not good anymore. But she made them herself.
I said nothing. There was nothing to say. We stood there. The cold came in off the water. The tea went cold too eventually, in his hands. He drank it cold. He went back to work. In his journal that night, I later learned, he wrote, "I heard today that my mother has died. The sky and earth have darkened. What more is there to say?" The false report came in the late winter of the following year. I will explain it simply, the way I understood it at the time, which was imperfectly. I was a chaplain's assistant, not a courtier, and the politics of the capital were a language I could barely read. A Japanese general, a clever man, by all accounts, and history gives him that much, had devised a plan. Not to defeat the fleet in battle, which experience had taught the Japanese was not easily done, but to remove the admiral from command without fighting him. He arranged for a false intelligence report to reach the Korean court. The report said that a large Japanese fleet was about to depart from a specific harbor on a specific night, and that if the Korean fleet moved quickly, it could destroy the enemy before they reached open water. The court sent orders to Yeosu. Attack immediately. The admiral read the orders. He sat with them for a long time. He knew the harbor in question. He had sailed those waters. He knew the particular difficulty of the approach, the tidal patterns, the rocks just below the surface, the narrow channel that would funnel our ships into a line and leave us unable to maneuver. He believed the report was false. He wrote back, "I believe this intelligence to be unreliable. The approach to this harbor is not navigable under battle conditions. To proceed would be to lose the fleet." The court read this as disobedience. The court read it, in fact, as exactly what Won-yoon had been suggesting in his letters for 2 years, that Yeosu had grown too proud, too independent, too certain of his own judgment over that of his king. The order came, "Come to Hanyang, be tried." He was to be arrested. I was in the cabin when he read this order. He read it once, set it down. He picked up his brush and noted the date and the weather in his journal, as he did every morning. Then he folded the order and placed it in a box alongside the previous correspondence, and stood up. "Prepare the dispatch boat," he said to me. "I need to write to my sons." He wrote to them for 2 hours. Then he surrendered himself to the officers sent to collect him. There is a period in this story when there is no admiral. He was taken to Hanyang. He was tried. He was found guilty of the charges against him: disobedience, failure to engage the enemy, and sentenced to death. And then, at the last moment, by the intervention of a minister who had enough courage and enough influence to change the course of the sentence, the death was commuted. He was not executed. He was demoted to the rank of common soldier. He would serve in the army, not the navy, as an ordinary foot soldier, without rank, without command, without the fleet he had built and held for 5 years, through every tide and season and loss. He was sent to the front lines as a private.
I did not know any of this while it was happening. The fleet was in disarray. Won-gyun was given command. I was reassigned to a shore post, carrying messages between supply stations, doing work that was necessary and invisible and had nothing to do with the sea. I thought about the Admiral. I tried to imagine him as a foot soldier. I could not do it. He was not built for the anonymous mass of an army. He was built for the precise, solitary, completely accountable weight of command, where every decision was his, every outcome traceable back to his hand on the tiller, his eye on the horizon. As a private soldier, he would be given orders by men who were wrong. He would have to obey them.
I thought about that for a long time. I prayed for him every morning, not just out of duty now, out of something that had become, over the years, very close to love. The quiet love you feel for someone who has let you stand beside them in the dark, which is a different thing from the love you feel for someone who asks you to stand beside them. He had never asked. He had simply not sent me away. In the capital, the falseness of the intelligence report became clear as the season turned. The Japanese fleet appeared in exactly the formations the Admiral had predicted. Won-gyun moved to engage them at Chilchon-ryang. The navigator died there. Most of the fleet died there. 160 Korean ships. Won-gyun fled to shore and was killed by Japanese soldiers on the beach. They brought him back. There was no ceremony, no apology from the court, no formal restoration of dignity, no acknowledgement that the man they had stripped of rank and sent to the front lines had been right about everything. There was only a new commission, written quickly in the emergency of disaster, restoring him to Admiral and commanding him to stop the Japanese fleet with whatever was left. Whatever was left was 13 ships. 13 against an estimated 333. I was assigned back to his staff within a day of his return. When I saw him, I was shocked. Not because he had changed dramatically. He had always been thin. He had always looked as though he were made of something denser than ordinary men, as though the same amount of material had been compressed into a smaller frame.
But there was something in his face, some element of brightness, I think, that I had never noticed when it was present, and now noticed only in its absence, that had gone. He had spent months as a private soldier at the front lines, watching men die around him for orders that were wrong, unable to say so, unable to change anything, unable to do the work he was made to do. He had watched the fleet he built be destroyed by the man who had undermined him. He had had no geomungo, no journal, no lantern on the deck at midnight. I brought him his tea on the first morning, strong tea, the way he had always had it. I set it on his table beside a new brush and a new journal. I had found the best paper I could, the heavy gray-white kind from the south that holds the ink cleanly without bleeding.
He looked at the journal for a moment.
He looked at me. He said nothing, but something in his face shifted slightly, some very small softening in the eyes. He opened the journal to the first page. He wrote, "Returned to command. 13 ships remain. The sea is clear today." He drank the tea. He went to work. The Battle of Myeongnyang was fought in a channel 120 meters wide. I will tell you what I know of it, which is imperfect, because I was on the second ship and not the command vessel. And in battle, especially a battle of this kind, the knowledge you have is very small and very local. You know the sound of the water and the sound of the guns and the smell of the smoke and the faces of the men around you, and very little else until it is over. But here is what I understood afterward, assembled from what I saw and heard and was later told.
The channel was called Uldolmak. It was famous to any sailor who knew those waters for its tidal currents, violent reversal currents that changed direction 4 times a day and that could move a ship laterally despite every effort of the oarsmen. The Japanese admirals knew this too, in the abstract. What they did not know, because they had not spent years sailing it in every weather and season, was exactly when the current would turn. Yi Sun-sin knew. He positioned the fleet at the narrowest point of the channel. He positioned them so that the current would be in our favor for exactly the window of the engagement, and then, when it turned, would be against the pursuing ships. He led from the front. The command ship went first into the channel, alone, against the first wave of Japanese vessels. The other 12 ships were to follow when the Admiral's drum signaled. From the second ship, I watched the Admiral's vessel sail into that channel. 333 ships were coming. He sailed toward them. The drum did not signal for a very long time. I have asked myself since, what was in his mind in those minutes? What does a man think about when he is sailing one ship against 300, buying time with the only currency he has, which is his own presence in the channel, which makes the Japanese admiral cautious, makes him slow down, makes him wonder what the Korean is not afraid of? I think I know. I think he was thinking about the current. I think he was watching the surface of the water with the same complete attention he gave everything that mattered, measuring the small signs of change, the color of a ripple, the behavior of floating debris, the slight shift in the sound of the channel, and waiting. The drums sounded. We went in. What happened next, I will not try to make beautiful, because it was not beautiful. It was loud and terrifying, and it smelled of burning wood and sulfur and blood. Men I had known for 3 years died in the time it takes to say their names. The Japanese ships crowded into the narrow channel, found they could not maneuver. The current turned against them. Their formations broke. We lost no ships. We killed more Japanese soldiers in that channel than I have the heart to count. When it was over, the Admiral walked the length of the command ship's deck slowly, looking at everything. The damage to the railing, the men who were hurt, the men who were not, the smoke still rising from the water outside the channel, where the Japanese ships had tried to disengage. He wrote in his journal that evening, "This day's work was heaven's will, not mine." He believed this, I think.
He was not a man given to false modesty about his abilities, but he was also not a man who believed that ability was sufficient explanation for outcomes. He had seen too many able men die. He had seen too many careful plans come apart on the simple fact of weather or timing or the random trajectory of a musket ball. He believed that he had done his work as well as he could, and that something beyond him, heaven, fate, the turn of a tide, had done the rest. I do not know if he was right, but I know that he believed it honestly. The war did not end. Myeongnyang was a miracle in the way that Hansondo had been a miracle, complete, unlikely, history-altering. And like Hansondo, it slowed the Japanese advance without stopping it. The land was still held. The villages were still burned. The roads were still dangerous. The king was still in exile. The court was still sending dispatches that were weeks out of date and sometimes dangerously wrong. We returned to the southern coast. The fleet was rebuilt, slowly, ship by ship, from whatever timber and iron could be found. The Admiral supervised everything. He slept some nights in the shipyard rather than return to the command vessel. He wanted to watch the progress in the early morning light before the carpenters arrived and check what had been done the day before and what had changed overnight in the drying wood. That winter, I grew a full beard for the first time. I mention this only because it is the kind of detail that locates a person in time. Not a battle, not a dispatch, just I grew a beard. It was cold. I was 22 years old and had been at war for 4 years. And some part of me was beginning to understand that this was my life, not a temporary disruption of my life. The Admiral's hair had gone almost completely white. I noticed this the way you notice gradual changes only when you see a person after an absence. But we had not been apart. I had been beside him for years. The white had arrived so slowly, I had watched it arrive without seeing it. He was 52 that winter. He had the posture of a man of 30 and the face of a man of 70, and the eyes of someone for whom age had become irrelevant because there was still so much to do. He played the geomungo that winter with a little more skill than before. Or perhaps I had simply come to understand the music better. It still searched. It still did not entirely find. But there were passages, brief ones, a few seconds long, where it settled into something that had the quality of arrival, of rest, and then moved on again. I wondered if he heard those passages, if he knew when they came. I think he did.
Edmund wants to be careful here. He does not want to make this too tidy. The story of a young man learning wisdom from an old one is an appealing shape, and I am wary of it, because the truth was messier and stranger than that shape suggests. I was not transformed by serving the Admiral. I was not made wise by proximity to wisdom. I remained, throughout those years, essentially what I had been, a netmaker's son from Yeosu, with a decent hand for calligraphy and a tendency to stand in doorways when I was uncertain what else to do. But I did learn some things. I learned that attention is a form of respect. The Admiral paid attention to everything, to the ships, to the men, to the weather, to the shape of coastlines that appeared on no official map. He paid attention to the millet in the bowl outside his door, in the sense that he noticed, once or twice, when it had not been taken back, and he looked at me with a brief question in his eyes that I took to mean, "Are you well enough to eat?"
I learned to pay attention in return,
I learned that silence is not absence. Some of the most complete conversations I had during those years were conversations in which almost nothing was said. There is a kind of silence that is simply emptiness, and there is another kind that is full of what both people already know and do not need to repeat. The Admiral lived in the second kind. Once you learned to hear it, it was as clear as speech. I learned that grief does not end. It changes shape. It becomes smaller in proportion to the person carrying it, not because they feel it less, but because they grow larger around it, take on more experience, more obligation, more love, and the grief becomes one weight among many rather than the only weight. But it does not go.
I watched the Admiral carry his mother for years after her death. I watched him carry the Navigator. I watched him carry every man whose name he had written in his journal on the day they died. He carried them the way he carried the cloth pouch of old bristles, because he was not yet certain what else to do with them. And I learned this. The most important thing you can offer someone who is carrying more than they should have to carry is not wisdom or strategy or even comfort. It is presence. The willingness to be in the same room, to stand in the doorway with the bowl of cold millet and not leave. In the last years of the war, the Chinese sent ships. The Chinese emperor had entered the conflict on the Korean side, eventually, after much deliberation and some considerable alarm about Japanese armies reaching the Yalu River, and the Ming fleet arrived in our waters with a great deal of ceremony, and an admiral named Chen Lin, who had strong opinions about everything, and was accustomed to being the most important naval commander in any room. He was not accustomed to Yeosu. The negotiations between the two admirals were conducted with elaborate courtesy and significant tension. Chen Lin wanted command of the combined fleet. He was, after all, representing the Emperor of China. His fleet was larger. His resources were greater. Yeosu listened to his arguments. He listened very carefully. He said, in terms that were diplomatically impeccable and absolutely firm, the combined fleet will operate best with a unified command structure that reflects the experience of each admiral in these specific waters. This was his way of saying, I know this coast, and you do not. Chen Lin was angry. And then, over the following months, as they fought together, and Chen Lin watched the admiral read the sea the way other men read a page, quickly, completely, understanding in an instant what others would puzzle over for hours, Chen Lin became something else. Not deferential, he was too proud for that, but attentive. I watched Chen Lin one evening, standing at the railing of the command ship, watching the admiral make a small decision about the fleet's night positioning. A slight adjustment, a handful of signals, a redeployment that took perhaps 5 minutes, and then watching the result of that decision play out over the following hour in the way the currents ran and the anchor chains settled. Chen Lin said something to his own aide in Chinese. I do not speak Chinese, but I saw the aide nod, and I saw Chen Lin look at the admiral with an expression I had seen before on the faces of the master shipwright, the doubting officers, the court ministers who had reluctantly sent him back after the disaster at Chilchonryong. It was the expression of a person who has decided, despite themselves, to trust. The end of the war came not through victory, but through collapse. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the Japanese ruler who had launched the invasions, died in the autumn of 1598. Without his ambition to sustain it, the invasion lost its purpose. The Japanese armies began to withdraw. The ships that had held the southern harbors for 6 years prepared to leave. There was a question of how they would leave. The Admiral wanted them stopped before they could reach open water. He had waited 7 years for this. He had held the southern sea with his body and his mind, and the particular stubborn genius that was the only thing about him I could never fully see, because I was too close to it. The way you cannot see a mountain when you are standing on it.
The Japanese fleet was attempting a breakout from the port of Suncheon, where the Japanese general Konishi Yukinaga had been besieged for months. He had sent word through intermediaries asking permission to leave peacefully. He had offered bribes to both Chen Lin and other commanders. Some of those commanders may have accepted. I do not know this for certain. I know only what I saw and what the Admiral believed. He believed, he knew, that to let the Japanese fleet escape intact was to leave the door open for the next invasion. He believed the only thing that would truly end this war was the removal of the navy that had sustained it. He was determined to meet them. He was 53 years old. He had not been home in 7 years. He had not seen his wife in 7 years.
The last letter from his youngest son had arrived 3 months before, and had been written in the careful, uncertain hand of a child who was no longer a child, who had grown into a young man during the years of his father's absence, learning to write in his father's shadow, not knowing what to say to a man he barely knew. The Admiral had read that letter on the upper deck, alone, as he always did. He had written back that same afternoon. I had copied the letter, as I had copied all the others. This one said, among other things, "When this is done, I will come home. I do not know exactly what home will look like now, but I will come, and we will find out together." I pressed the Admiral's seal into the wax. I handed the letter to the messenger. The messenger rode north.